Okay, the design argument, also known as the teleological argument, or the argument from design, is probably the argument that if you believe in God for a reason, or if when someone says, "Why do you believe in God?" you give a reason, it's probably this one. This is the one that, of the big three classic arguments for the existence of God, of theism, this is the one that I think has the most intuitive pull. The big three are the ontological argument. There's a chapter on that in the book that your reading comes from on this argument. But I have never found even the most religious people who find it convincing, so I'm not going to bother with the ontological argument. The advantage of the ontological argument is if it works, it proves the existence of a perfect being. The design argument, even if it works, it's not clear that it proves what a theist would want it to prove. Even if the design argument indeed does prove the existence of a designer, it's not clear that that designer fits theism's view, with all of the perfections of all-powerful, all-loving, all the omnis. And of course, the third argument is the cosmological argument, and we'll come to that in a bit. So, it's an attempt to prove, using reason, the existence of the God of theism. And if it works, essentially you don't need faith to believe in God. You should believe in God in the same way that you believe in electrons or you believe in magnetic force. There are very good reasons for believing it, and it can be proved. So, it's a powerful thing if it works. Now, the most famous version of the teleological argument is by an English theologian called Paley, who was writing around 1800, the beginning of the 19th century. This is not the first, by any means, the first version of the design argument. Probably the most famous early one is by Aquinas in the 1200s. In fact, Aquinas gives sort of canonical versions of all of the big three arguments and a couple more. But his arguments are written in a way that is kind of tied to Aristotelian philosophy, and sometimes they're not very appealing. Whereas this guy, Paley, wrote a version that was basically designed for using in sermons. So it's very evocative. And as it involves a watch, it's sometimes called the watchmaker argument. And it goes something like this. He says, imagine you're walking on a bleak, deserted moor. Let's bring that into the 21st century. Imagine you're the first person on Mars. You are Matt Damon. Only it's just you on the surface of Mars. And you're the Neil Armstrong of Mars. And you're sort of bouncing along through the red Martian dust, kicking rocks out of the way and not giving them a second thought. And then suddenly you see something that looks like a watch. What would you think? If you see something that looks like a watch, you would think, says Paley, and I think he's right, essentially you would think, we are not alone. What you would not think is, wow, that's an interesting rock formation. Amazing how it works like a watch, and yet it's a natural formation. You would not think that. Why? Because the thing about a watch is it looks designed. Now, let's be specific about what that means. What does looking designed entail? It entails being complex. That's one thing. So it's different from a rock. A rock is very simple. It's just a rock. Whereas a watch is complex. It's got all of these little parts. But it's not enough just to be complex, because actually if you look at a rock close enough, it's complex too. It's got all of these it's got a crystalline structure. You'll see that it has structure that is fairly complicated. So being complex in itself is not enough. It's got to have teleology. So what is teleology, and why is the design argument called teleology? Teleology is working towards a goal. So having a function, the telos, which is a Greek word, is often translated as the function or purpose of something. So the complexity works for a purpose, has a function. And finally, this is another feature. I'm not sure if this is an essential feature, but this is certainly a feature. If one part was removed, it would no longer serve the function. It ceases to function. So, for example, if you open the back of a watch, does anybody have wind-up watches anymore? I used to have one, but even I was kind of out of date when I had one. If you open the back of a wind-up watch, it's got all these springs in it and cogs, and if you remove any one of them, the whole thing ceases to work. So the thing that is distinctive about a watch is the reason why it looks designed is because you think it couldn't have happened naturally, that all of these separate parts come together to work together as a whole. Individually, each of the parts, you might think, well, that's an odd-shaped rock, and it's, a cog is an odd-shaped rock or whatever. Crystals form that have very regular shapes and so on, and we don't think, oh, that had to have been designed. But it's more than that. It's that they all work together to produce this function. So it's sort of a holistic view. That's part of the design appearance. So a watch has this appearance of being designed, which consists of having these features. Now, what do we know about watches? They all have designers. That is, they don't occur naturally. They had to be made to have all of those features. Okay, fine. That's a watch. So what? Well, then, of course, Paley says, but look at, and Paley actually doesn't pick the human eye. He picks the universe as a whole. But I think it's more evocative if you focus on the human eye, because the appearance of the eye is much more obviously designed. Because if you look at the way an eye works, it's amazing. It has all of these parts. You've got the retina, which has light-sensitive cells on it, rods on the outside, cones in the middle. It's got the lens, which can be changed so that the focus can change, less so as you get older. Get ready for that, kids. And it's got, so basically the eye is like an amazing camera. Super duper, even very incredibly light sensitive and so on, as it says in the book. So the eye has all of these parts that work together to achieve this function. If your lens was removed, it wouldn't work. If the retina was removed, it wouldn't work. So it's got all of the same features that when we see them in a watch lead inexorably to the conclusion that it was designed. So our conclusion is the eye had a designer too. And Paley likes to say, the eye is so much more perfect than a watch. It's so much more sophisticated and so on, that the designer of the eye had to have been that much better than a human designer to have achieved such perfection. All right, so Paley's version of it certainly appears to be an argument by analogy. Arguments by analogy are common and quite powerful tools that philosophers use. Everybody uses them. You use them in teaching, among other things. So basically you say, they work like this. They say, something we're familiar with has properties X, Y, and Z. This new thing that we've just come across obviously has properties X and Y. In that respect, because it has properties x and y, it's like the thing we're familiar with. That also has properties x and y. Well, but look, the thing that we're familiar with also has this property z, and although we haven't observed that in this new thing, we can conclude that because it's similar in respects x and y, it will be similar in respect z. And therefore, the new thing has property z. And property z in this case is obviously having a designer. So a watch has all of these features and a designer. An eye has all of these features. Therefore, it also has a designer. That's understanding Paley's argument as an argument by analogy. Now, Paley wrote after the great Scottish philosopher David Hume. David Hume was a skeptic. He was a skeptic about most things. He was also a skeptic, unusually for his time, about God. He's the first famous non-religious early modern philosopher. All of the other greats like Descartes, Locke, Berkeley, Leibniz, Spinoza, all of these guys, they all except Spinoza. Well, Spinoza converted to Catholicism, but he started out Jewish. They're all theistic, certainly. They all believe in the God of theism. Hume is the first one to come along and say, yeah, I'm not buying it. But this is a dangerous thing to say. Most people knew that he had these skeptical views, but he never published anything on it in his lifetime. In fact, he required that the main work that he wrote that questioned theism, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, should be published after his death, and it was. And it's in dialogue form, so it's fairly readable. And it consists of 3 characters arguing about it. Philo is, everyone assumes, basically short for philosopher and stands for human. He's the skeptic. And then you have Cleanthes and Demea. Cleanthes is someone who believes in natural theology, which is the kind of thing that Aquinas does, where you prove God, where you give all these reasonable arguments that you should believe in God in the same way that you should believe in electrons. And then finally, Demea is the faith guy. Demea says you can't give arguments, you just have to accept it on faith. So those are the 3 characters. And it contains, this work, savage critiques of the argument from design, understood as an argument by analogy. Now, as I said, this was published before Paley wrote his argument, but nonetheless it's considered pretty effective against Paley's argument. And there's a lot going on in Hume, and some of it you have to understand his wider philosophy to really get. So I'm just crudely summarizing a lot of his points. First point, the argument from design by analogy is a too weak analogy. That is, arguments by analogy only work insofar as they do work if the 2 things being compared are pretty close. So for example, suppose I've always driven a 1979 Oldsmobile Cutlass. Every time one breaks down, I find a new one somewhere because I just love that model. And I say, the 1979 Oldsmobile Cutlass tends to have radiator problems. I know this to my cost. Long story. But anyway, but nonetheless, I love this vehicle. So I say, well, I have had 10 of these, and now I'm getting a new one. And I say, all 10 of the 1979 Oldsmobile Cutlasses I've had radiator problems. Therefore, this 1979 Cutlass will have radiator problems. That's a pretty strong argument by analogy. Why? Because I'm comparing a 1979 Oldsmobile Cutlass to other 1979 Oldsmobile Cutlasses. So they're likely to be similar. Contrast that with, suppose I've had 10 1979 Oldsmobile Cutlass and I'm just fed up of overheating, so I said I'm going to get a new Toyota Prius. I hear good things. So I get a new Toyota Prius and I say, well, my Toyota Prius is a car. All of the cars I've owned before have had radiator problems, so this one will have radiator problems. Is that a strong argument by analogy? No, of course not. Why? Because a Toyota Prius, while it's a car and has a radiator, is not the same, has important differences from a 1979 Oldsmobile Cutlass. Specifically, with a Cutlass, there's a particular little cardboard grommet, or whatever you call it, that corrodes. And in order to replace this 5-cent thing, you have to lift the entire engine out because of the design, and it costs you hundreds of dollars to have that done. But it always wears out because it's cheap and crappy. Anyway, so you see that for arguments to analogy, from analogy to be strong, the things being compared have to be fairly close. And the trouble is, a watch is not that similar to an eye. For one thing, eyes have a very important difference. We know where eyes come from. They're attached to animals, and we know where the animals come from. They come from other animals. Was I designed? I have an eye. Did I have to be made like a watch? No, my parents did not make me in a laboratory. They just produced me in the way that, the stork brought me, let's say. So just in case your parents haven't given you the talk yet. But whatever it was, I was not designed in the way that every watch is designed. So there's a ready explanation for where I came from. I was produced by others of my kind. And the eye is the same way. So Hume says, actually, animals are like vegetables, and we don't, when we walk around and we see vegetation, we're less likely to make the conclusion that it was designed. Now, of course, if we have a theistic train of thought, we probably would, but the point is that there's important differences, that the wider apart the two things being compared are, the more likely the argument is to be weak and to fail. I mean, if I say, the moon is spherical, this basketball is spherical. I can dribble this basketball, so therefore I can dribble the moon. Stupid argument, because there's only one similarity and there's all kinds of differences. All right, so the problem is too weak analogy. Now, how would we strengthen the analogy? Well, if we strengthen the analogy, it turns out that they have a lot more in common than we thought. But the theist isn't going to like that. If these two are, the closer these two are together, the more similar their designers are going to be. So what do we know about designers of watches? They're mortal. They're fallible. They work in groups. In fact, not one single person designed a watch. It's a long process of sort of evolution of design. Somebody designed a very simple time recording mechanism, like a candle with stripes on the side for how long it takes to melt down, and then somebody improved on the design, and somebody improved on the design. So nobody sort of out of nowhere came up with a watch design ex nihilo. It's sort of a process of refining ideas over centuries and over hundreds of different people. So there's no one designer of a watch. Well, if we apply that thinking, then maybe there's no one designer of an eye. And what do we know about watches? Well, they're fallible. They break down. They have design flaws. Every human design thing has a design flaw, like the 1979 Oldsmobile Cutlass. And in fact, if you look at the eye, the human eye has a design flaw. I can't remember if I mentioned this already, but we have a blind spot. We have a blind spot that we don't even notice. It's in the middle of our vision, and the reason we don't notice is because our brain compensates. There's actually a big gap in the middle where there aren't cells on the retina. There aren't cones or rods. And the reason why there aren't cones or rods on that part of the retina in the center of our vision, which is, a pretty important part, is because the optic nerve attaches to the retina on the front, which is stupid. It would be much better if it attached in from the back. And guess what? In the octopus, it does attach on the back. The octopus has a better eye than us because it doesn't have this flaw. Now, if your explanation for the human eye is that it was designed by God, then why did God give us this design flaw? He didn't have to, because look at the octopus. Of course, if an alternative explanation for that is that we're the product of evolution, and evolution just, things happen by accident, and if they happen to work well enough for you to reproduce, then they stick with the design. So evolution has a good explanation for why we would have a design flaw. We're not actually designed. It just happened at random, and it worked well enough. So that's the problem. If the argument by analogy is strong enough, then it has all kinds of conclusions about God that make him very much not the God of theism. He's just some kind of imperfect being. He might be, like in that movie Prometheus, Ridley Scott movie that was supposed to be reboot the Alien franchise a few years ago. It turns out in that movie that we're designed by aliens as sort of little mini-me's of them. They're sort of giant versions of us, and they don't care about us, and we're just sort of an experiment, and they're going to come and kill us off pretty soon. Maybe we're designed by aliens. That would make more sense than that we're designed by a being that is beyond all our comprehension. Because if he's beyond all our comprehension, how can he be like a human designer, after all? Finally, related to this, is the problem of evil, which, of course, is the subject of another video in this unit. Problem of evil is the problem of explaining why there is so much suffering and bad things in this world if they're the product of an all-good, all-powerful God. And certainly, if God designed everything in the world, then everything in the world is God's responsibility. So why are there so many horrible things in the world, like Halapo-Siemens syndrome, as I describe it in the other video? Or there's a worm. The great British television personality, David Attenborough, is famous. If you've ever watched a nature documentary and it's got a kind of breathy, posh English voice over it, that's David Attenborough, and he is my absolute hero. He's in his 90s now. I expect to hear about his death any moment, and it's going to break me. But he was once asked, he was presented an award for his services to television by some Belgium TV station. And he was once asked, well, you've seen all these wonders of nature. You've described them all in all of your documentaries. Does that make you religious? And he said, no. And he said, the reason why it doesn't make me religious is because, yes, there are wonderful things. There are butterflies' wings and all that kind of business. And I am awestruck by all of those. But I also know about other things, like there's a particular worm that lives in the water in rivers in West Africa. And when humans drink it, particularly children, it navigates to their eye, and it subsists on eating through humans' eyes and blinding them. That's what that does. That's the only thing that particular bug does. And he says, and if I thought that was designed by God, then God made this thing where the only thing that it can do is blind little African children. That's how it lives. It's not intending to do anything wrong. That's how it was designed. If I thought God produced that, then how is that consistent with an all-loving God? So that's the problem of evil, if you believe, the problem of evil for God the designer. Okay. Now, sometimes in response to these criticisms, these famous criticisms by Hume, it is suggested that you can save the argument by design by recasting it as a different kind of argument. Because these are specifically attacks on the argument as an argument by analogy. But if it's not an argument by analogy, then it won't have these problems. And what it could be is an abductive argument. I also mentioned this in the video on the problem of evil, but that is, an abductive argument is sometimes known as inference to the best explanation. For example, this is an example from work on philosophy of science. I think it's been years, by a guy called Bas van Fraassen. But imagine in my house I noticed the following phenomena. I noticed there are holes where the floor meets the wall, holes in the wall. I noticed that I'm hearing little scratching, squeaking sounds. I noticed that when I leave cheese out overnight, tiny bits are missing in the morning. And here's the kicker, there's mouse shit everywhere. Okay, that's a mystery, that's a set of mysteries. What's the best explanation? The best explanation is the one that can explain the simplest. And obviously in this case it's that I have mice. That's the best. I haven't seen them, notice, but it is reasonable for me to believe they exist because they explain observable phenomena, simplest and best. Okay, so that's inference to the best explanation. The best explanation of that phenomena is to believe I have mice, so I should believe that I have mice. The best explanation for the appearance of design that Paley noted is that they actually were designed, and designed by God. So it's not an analogy between a watch and an eye, it's just focusing on the features of the eye and saying what could be the best explanation of these. Okay, the problem with that version is evolution. That's great for when there aren't many alternate candidates. When you've only got one explanation, it's going to be the best explanation. But what if there are other theories that can explain everything that God can without having to say that there's a God? They would be simpler. And evolution appears to do that. So for example, what evolution does is it explains how things can appear designed without there actually being a designer. So why do giraffes have long necks? Well, the simple answer, which is a teleological answer, is to reach the leaves. So that makes it sound like somebody saw that giraffes are going to need to reach the leaves, and they gave them something that would serve that function. So that their necks are designed to serve that function. And that's teleology seems to be best explained by somebody designing something to meet that function. Whereas what evolution comes along and says, specifically natural selection, is it says the reason giraffes have long necks is the short-necked ones died out. That's too simple. But basically it says, look, we know that animals produce offspring like them, but with minor differences, like you are not the same as your siblings, even though you're both products of your parents. You're different. So there are differences, mutations, between offspring. And so what happened was some fairly short-necked creature produced an animal that had a slightly longer neck, and it was able to reach vegetation that the shorter-necked ones couldn't. They would starve before they could pass on their genes to their offspring. This survived long enough to pass on its genes to its offspring. Some of the offspring also had short necks. They died. Some of them had long necks. They survived. And gradually, it's self-correcting so that the long-necked ones continue to survive. And eventually, you get giraffes that are fit. They're survival of the fittest, most fit for their surroundings. Now, Darwin came up with this theory by visiting the Galapagos and noticing that different islands in this archipelago had different tortoises. On islands with lots of lush vegetation, the regular tortoises. On other islands, they had ones with a sort of lip in their shell and long necks, and that was where the vegetation was sparse. And he said, well, they're all giant tortoises. They must have a common ancestor. Why is it that on this island they have longer necks? And he came up with this theory. So that's an explanation of the human eye that doesn't require a designer. Now, unsurprisingly, you might think, theists aren't taking Darwin as the end of theism. So there are responses to the idea that evolution is a better explanation than God. Here's a couple. Intelligent design. This was a big thing in the 90s, I want to say. there were all kinds of court cases about it. And in fact, there's an excellent PBS documentary on the court case about teaching intelligent design in, I think, it's either Pennsylvania. Yeah, I think it's Pennsylvania. There's a similar case in Kansas as well. But the intelligent design advocates argued that their theory should be taught equally with Darwin in public schools. And I think some conservatives got hold of a school board, like they're doing now, and got it to happen. And then a teacher, a science teacher, I don't know if he was sued for not giving both sides or if he sued for saying, I'm not going to teach this stuff. And they had a court case about whether or not intelligent design was science and therefore could be taught as in a science class in public school. And they brought in all of the experts on intelligent design, including most famously a guy called Michael Behe, B-E-H-E, who is at, Pennsylvania. I actually applied for a job there once. C.J. McCollum is a famous alum in basketball, the only one ever. It'll come to me in a second. Anyway, so he wrote this book, Michael Behe, called Darwin's Black Box, arguing for intelligent design. And what he argued is that actually evolution couldn't do the job of explaining all the things that that theism could. Now, notice another of the features of intelligent design is it's not creationism. Creationism is the older theory, which says essentially that the Bible is correct and God made the world in 6 days, and and you have creationists who believe that the world is a few thousand years old because somebody counted the number of generations in the Bible and worked out that there had been so many generations since Adam, so the Earth must be, and it's like 4,000 to 6,000 years old. And so young Earth creationists believe that. But of course that's obviously religious, and it's obviously tied to the Bible, so it's one religion, it's not all religions. And therefore that's a good reason for not teaching it in the public schools. Whereas intelligent design isn't explicitly religious, it just says that there's a designer. It doesn't say it's God, it says it could be the aliens from Prometheus. It could be time travelers, which would get you that paradox of like where your own grandfather or grandmother. It could be all of these things, but it just can't be evolution, says intelligent design. Why can't it be evolution? Well, because of irreducible complexity. Oh, I know, I meant to buy a mousetrap. I hope you are familiar with mousetraps. Mousetraps are very simple devices where there are a board, a piece of wood, a spring, a latch, a thing that comes down that when it's triggered that breaks the poor mouse's back, and a little spike to put the cheese on. So there are like 5 components apparently to a mousetrap. And without any one of those, the mousetrap will not function. It won't work. So irreducible complexity says sometimes you have things where they can only do their function if they have at least, in this case 5, but that's a simple example. At least several things put together. And this is not something that evolution can produce, because evolution works by tiny, tiny incremental changes over millions of years. And you can't do a tiny, tiny incremental change that produces all 5 at once. You can only do an incremental change that will add like a little, change one of them slightly. It can't, and on what this says is, with cases of irreducible complexity, that's useless. The only way that the function that you need it to perform can be performed is if they all come together at once. So evolution cannot produce them, it has to have been designed. And the classic example, so a mousetrap is just an analogy for illustration, not for argument, but the actual example of something in nature that exhibits irreducible complexity is the bacterial flagellum. And the bacterial flagellum is a tiny little people who study it call it like a molecular motor, because it's the thing on the tail of a tiny, tiny, tiny bacterium that it wiggles and propels it through the medium in which it swims. So it is like a little motor. And like a motor, it has all these bits that work together. And they're composed of little proteins, but you have to have a certain kind of protein combination. If you miss any one of the combinations, you have a dead motor and it won't work at all. So the bacterial flagellum, according to Michael Behe, exhibits irreducible complexity and therefore has to have been designed. But the best part of this NOVA documentary and of the court case, which has public transcripts, is all of these biologists who came to disprove his claims. And one of them showed up in court wearing a mousetrap with the... so in a mousetrap, you have to have the thing that holds the back-breaking element back that is very easily triggered. So when the mouse eats the cheese, this is removed and the clip comes down. If you don't have that, you can't prime the mousetrap, and you would just have it closed, and so it's useless as a mousetrap. But what the guy did is he showed what you can use it for is a tie clip, because you just pull it apart and it holds the two parts of your tie. People don't use tie clips anymore, but you can use it as a tie clip. It holds the two parts of your tie together so they don't, go off in different directions. And he used the mousetrap as that. And what's that? That was a very nice illustration that showed, yes, you cannot arrive at something that performs the function of a mousetrap instantly. But that doesn't mean that you wouldn't have arrived at it through evolution, because what the assumption that Michael Behe is making is that either it has the function of a mousetrap or it's useless. But that's a false dilemma. It could have something that is almost a mousetrap could work as something else, and therefore would be one step away from a mousetrap, and then by a random mutation becomes a mousetrap, and then performs that function. So long as at every stage you perform some function, then that's enough for evolution to work. That's enough for it to be advantageous and why it might be reproduced, because it enables the thing that has it to survive long enough to make more like it. And in fact, there is something almost exactly like the bacterial flagellum, just one tiny difference. It's not a motor, but it is an injecting system. And there are other bacteria that use that as an injecting system to inject poisons into other things. So they have something that is one step away from a bacterial flagellum, and therefore could make the jump to a bacterial flagellum by an evolutionary process. So that kind of put the kibosh on Michael Behe's whole argument of irreducible complexity. An alternative response to evolution is the fine-tuning argument. And here's how it goes. It's something like this is the response. People who go for the fine-tuning argument say, yes, you're right. Animals are the product of evolution over millions of years. The story in biology textbooks is right. You cannot, so this approach already says you can't take the Bible literally. No, God didn't make us make each thing individually. What God did was God made the universe, and the universe has all of the requisite features so that evolution can happen. So God intended for us to be made, but instead of making us by hand, he made the factory that then produces us. So, the creationism story says God individually hand makes each species as a different thing. The fine-tuning says, no, you're right, evolution is, we're all products of evolution, we all share one common ancestor, which is a single cell that arose in the swamps. You've seen Fantasia. Well, the section on Stravinsky's Rite of Spring illustrates this, little tiny single-cell organisms that eventually develop into the various trees of evolution. Fine, that's the product. But God had to exist because even though we're the product of evolution, once certain parameters are set up, the parameters wouldn't have appeared that way naturally. It's so unlikely that we would have a universe that has all of the features that allow evolution to be possible, that the only possible explanation for that happening, it's so unlikely otherwise, is God. As it says in the reading, some people say, if gravity was 1/billionth stronger, then planets wouldn't have formed. Matter wouldn't clump together. You just get chaos. No, if it was weaker. And if it was stronger, then things would clump together too much and no life could happen. So it's only all of these different levers of the universe. This is sometimes called the levers of the universe argument. All of the settings that you had to, if you were designing a universe where evolution was possible, there's all of these different variables that had to be set to exactly what they're set to. And if they're set even slightly different, any one of them is set slightly different. If any of the laws of the universe were slightly different, life wouldn't be possible. So the fact that in the universe, it's possible for evolution to happen is a cosmic miracle on such an unlikely scale that the only possible explanation is God. Now notice this is no longer really now the thing that is being explained is not the appearance of design, it's the appearance of, it's the settings on the levers of the universe. So it's not really the design argument anymore, but that's why it's called the fine-tuning argument. I want to say one thing before I get into the argument itself. It's kind of a bad thing if you say God allows evolution to occur. God didn't design as possible. Why? Because of the problem of evil. How does evolution work? Evolution is a horrible process. Evolution is where the vast majority of us die horribly. Evolution produces the eye-eating worm. Evolution produces carnivores who can't survive except by eating in a horrible way vegetarians who want to live, but if they escape, then the carnivores will die. So evolution produces these cases where it's a zero-sum game. You can't have both of them living happily side by side. One has to eat the other or starve. Evolution is horrible. Evolution is suffering, in extreme amounts. So if that's the process by which God allowed us to be produced, then, you got the problem of evil in spades. So that's one comment. The usual response to the fine-tuning argument is that it exhibits the lottery fallacy. That is, imagine there's a lottery and there are 1 billion tickets, or how many of us are there? There's 8 billion. And so there's 8 billion tickets and I get the winning ticket. Now, some people think I must be blessed by God because I'm the winner. But mathematicians would say, no, somebody had to win, and it was you. So there was a 100% chance of there being a winner, and it's just your good fortune that it's you. But the fact that there was a winner is unsurprising. So don't go thinking that you're divinely blessed. And they suggest that the fine-tuning argument is like this. So the fact that we exist to talk about this stuff proves that the universe had to have been like this. And yes, it's incredibly unlikely that the universe would be like that, but that doesn't show that it's designed. If the universe didn't turn out like this, then we wouldn't be around to ask the question. But given that we're around to ask the question, then the universe had to be like this. Well, they get into all of that discussion of, well, there's unlikely and then there's surprising, and see what you think of that discussion. Another issue is, well, if there's only one universe, then obviously it's incredibly surprising. But there are these theories that suggest that there are an infinite number of parallel universes. And if there's an infinite number of parallel universes, then it's just like the lottery. All of the other parallel universes are the losers. But it's not surprising at all that there would be one winner where evolution was possible. And of course, that's the one where there are people saying, hey, we're amazingly blessed and designed by God because evolution happened. Well, no, you wouldn't be around to say anything. So if there are parallel universes, then it's much more like the case of lottery. Now, are there parallel universes? We don't know, but there are some theories of physics that suggest that. All right, last word on the design argument. I think the key problem with the design argument is this one. Who designed the designer? Think of what the design argument is saying. And incidentally, this is the first criticism that most people come up with. Like, I think if you're a kid, you can come up with this, if you're a thoughtful kid. Here's how the design argument works. It says, look at the complexity of nature. Look at the eye. Look at the way the planets work. Look at life. It's too complicated. It's got all of these features. There has to have been a designer. So in other words, the way it works is that when you see complexity of a certain kind, you are driven to look for an explanation. And unless there is an explanation, it's unsatisfactory. There's some kind of gap. Okay, but then look at the designer. The designer explains this. But then look at the designer. Isn't the designer going to be more complex than this? Because the designer is something, obviously, the designer of a watch is more complicated than a watch. And the designer has to at least be as complicated as the thing that he or she designs. As Hume says, a designer is somebody who has the complete plans of the thing they design in their mind. So the complexity of their mind is at least equal to the complexity of the final product. They've got the blueprint in their mind. That's complex in itself. And that's a feature of the designer themselves. So the designer is at least as complicated as the thing that they supposedly designed. So then, the thing that prompted you to argue there has to be a designer has to prompt you to say that there has to be a designer of the designer. Because now there's this unexplained complexity. This unexplained complexity made you say that there had to be a designer. But then the designer has unexplained complexity. So that they have to have been designed. And then they have to have been designed. So it ends up being no explanation at all, just an infinite regress. Now, theists have attempted various responses to this. Perhaps the silliest is they've argued that God is simple, that God is not complex in the way that God's design is. God is simple because God is perfect. That's not what simple means. Like, you're just messing with the word simple. You're saying Occam's razor says the simplest explanation is the best one. I think God is the best one, so God must be the simplest one. No, that's not how simple works. That's just silly. So I think this one is always going to be the hardest problem. If you then say, well, I'm sorry, God is the kind of thing that does not need explaining. Well, then you've just said, oh, if that's a move I'm allowed, if I'm allowed to say that there's certain kinds of complexity that doesn't have to be explained with a designer, let's just stop at the world. I'm going to say this complexity doesn't need explaining. So that's what it gets into. But it does seem to me a pretty bad Achilles heel of the design argument. All right, there you go.